OK, Ron, well, I'd like to take you back nearly 24 years ago, if I can, when your consortium took over the club. The team was pretty much in freefall under Malcolm Allison. You made changes almost immediately.
Yeah, I made changes, also made quite a lot of the wrong changes. I remember having a meeting with the vice presidents in the executive lounge and telling them that I'd sort the club out in 12 months. In actual fact, it took me 4 years to sort the club out really financially. But it was interesting. I seem to remember typing the contract for sale myself in Ray Bloy's boardroom at the Christmas party, round about the 23rd of December. We completed in January, 26th of January I think it was. And in between that time, of course, I agreed to stay on with Malcolm. And then, of course, between exchange and completion, 3 players, Burridge, Fenwick and Flanagan, I thought were transferred at a ridiculous figure to Queen's Park Rangers. And I felt, as I'd agreed with Bloy, no players would be transferred between exchange and completion, that I was being sold down the river a bit. So I decided not to go ahead with Malcolm, which in a way was a shame because he subsequently ended up as a very good friend of my wife and I. And I would have liked to work with him for a while just to see how it went. But the club at that time had 10 points. We had to sell a player every month just to pay the wages. I think the first one was Jerry Francis. And then, of course, we had the transfer of Peter Nicholas to Arsenal. And we got through to March with that and really just about scraped through the season. But that's what was happening.
Well, you brought Dario Gradi in, of course, from Wimbledon, your previous club. That didn't quite work out as you had hoped, perhaps.
No, but I think what was happening was that there was so much going on behind the scenes that Dario really never had a chance. In retrospect, I should have brought Bassett in at that time instead of leaving David at Wimbledon, because for 3 weeks I owned both clubs. And Dario, to me, was a superb coach and would have been great for Palace, as I'm sure he's now proved. But the fans really didn't give Dario any time, but most of all, the players were still a very close-knit group from the previous ownership. And I think Jim Cannon and one or two others there were as much, probably more anti-me than anti-Dario at the time. And it made it even that much harder for us. And really, Dario had to change the team, and he needed more time because he went back to the old Chelsea reserve side, really, and brought people like Tommy Langway in and players like that. And then, of course, ultimately Steve Wicks, who again ended up back at Queen's Park Rangers with an injury that nobody could actually find out while he was at Palace, but he suddenly was fit enough to play for them as soon as he got there. So it was sad, really, the Dario episode, and something that I regret.
You brought in perhaps fans' favourite Steve Kember at that stage, but that didn't quite work out either, did it?
No, it didn't work out because I appointed Steve at Dario's wages. And within 2 or 3 days, Steve felt that he should have been on the same salary as the highest player, which at that time I think was Paul Barron on $34,000 a year, which was more than double what Steve was on. Well, there's an argument, I suppose, for the manager being worth as much as the highest player, but it wouldn't survive today for very long. And of course, I think the problem with Steve, because I had brought Steve back from Canada to run the youth team, so I had very high regard for him. And we're still close friends. But again, to his detriment, I suppose, I put him in charge too early in his career, because ultimately I think he could have been a Palace manager if he'd progressed perhaps through the reserve team and then to the manager at a later date. And I think circumstances just brought Dario in too early and brought Steve Kember in too early. They were good appointments, but they were premature.
And then you brought in Alan Mullery for a couple of seasons, but clearly with his Brighton connections, the Palace fans didn't take to him too well, did they?
No, and I suppose if I'd have been a long-term Palace fan, which I have to own up, because as a kid I supported Derby County, even though they were years away, and then I'd owned Wimbledon. So we came actually tarnished with the Wimbledon brush that we were the owners of Wimbledon, which I found difficult to understand, because a manager comes in from one club to another and he does the best job, and he's considered to be part of that club. And when I came to Palace, I wasn't considered to be part of Crystal Palace, even though it was 7 days a week and every hour of the day was involved in trying to deal with the problems at the club. And of course, Palace had in all the time that I'd ever known anything about it, it's always had financial problems, one financial crisis after another. So I had to put that right, because one thing was I didn't have unlimited funds to pump in if we were losing. So really that's what happened.
And then you did eventually bring Dave Bassett in, but he only stayed for a few days, decided it wasn't quite the right move for him.
Yeah, he did, and to be fair to David, I suppose it was the right move for David. At that time I felt it was the wrong move for us, but on the other hand, I went straight to Steve Coppell, and I'd met Steve because I was doing quite a bit of scouting then, which is something that I like to do, and I met Steve in the car park at Leeds United, watching a Leeds game, and he'd been abroad, and so I had him in the back of my mind. I then spoken to him at a conference and really advised him as to how he could become a manager, and this was all prior to the Dave Bassett situation. But when Dave left, I spoke to Steve and I said, look, I'm not giving you, perhaps I'd learned a few lessons, I'm not passing over Crystal Palace to you without any experience. So I'd like you to talk to Ian Evans. I said, I've got high regard for Ian, he's been Barnsley, he's got experience. I said, if you can get on with Ian, go and see him. And I said, then I would let the two of you take over the club. Ian would buy you the time to be successful and to learn the ropes. So Steve went up north of England. He'd not really spoken to Ian before. They spent the day together, and he phoned me and said that they'd both like to apply for the job, so I gave it to them.
It was very much an inspired choice, but looking back, it must have seemed like a little bit of a risk, because Steve obviously didn't have any managerial experience, and indeed he was quite young at that stage, wasn't he?
Well, he was young, but I mean, I was just a football nut. I wasn't probably the typical director or chairman of a club, and I really just wanted somebody who I could get on in partnership with in football. The business side I could take care of, that was a separate thing, but I was really only interested in the football side. Which is why I was in football right at the beginning anyway. And
as you say, you did quite a lot of scouting at that stage with Steve,
well, I'd like to take credit for that, but I didn't have anything to do with Ian Wright. But I did have a lot to do with a number of players that probably the fans aren't aware of. I mean, Jeff Thomas, Chris Coleman, Mark Bright, all of those I scouted and introduced them to Steve. And then what would happen, I would then take Steve along to see the players. I mean, I can remember Jeff Thomas, he must have seen on 6 occasions with me, and each time wasn't inspired at all. And I was trying to push Steve to sign. This was a problem. I'd like a player, and I had to persuade Steve that we should sign him, because he was the manager. There was no point. If Steve didn't want to sign him, couldn't get anywhere. I mean, finally we bought Jeff Thomas because we had £50,000 spare one summer. So we bought Jeff, which was fantastic. But again, I remember Chris Coleman. My in-laws lived in Swansea, and I was there a lot. And Chris was 18 and playing left back for Swansea. And I took Steve to see Chris Coleman, and I distinctly remember, probably on about the 4th occasion, it was Christmas time, may have been New Year's Day. Swansea were playing at home, and we went down there with Ian. I got in the car after the match, and after 10 minutes Chris Coleman had done enough for me. I thought, thank goodness for that, Steve will want to buy him. 10 minutes of the game. After the match, Steve got in the car with Ian, and I didn't say a word. And Steve then said, didn't do anything for me, And Ian said, not me either. And I couldn't believe it. And in the end, of course, I made a bid for Chris Coleman at Tribunal, the 150. As it turned out, they told us it's 275, and Steve and I were outside, and I thought, there's no way Steve's going to pay 275 for him. He didn't want to sign him to start with. And Steve just turned around and said, Ron, he's big, strong, physically fit, he's only this age, you'll get your money back. And he did the complete about turn outside. So we bought Chris Coleman. And Mark Bright, I remember I saw Mark Bright come on as a substitute for Port Vale away to Southend. And we were desperate for a centre forward at the time. And I just woke up one morning, phoned Steve and said, we got to sign Mark Bright. I said, you can hit the ball to him doesn't matter, head, chest, thighs, feet. I said, he controls it immediately. You've got to go and see Mark Bright. So the last time I saw Mark was that week playing at Leicester City for their reserves against Everton. He scored 3 goals and got booed all the time. They didn't like him. So Steve went away to Manchester City reserves. And he went on his own, and I went somewhere else, and I picked him up after the match. I went to another game. We're up in Manchester. And I picked him up, and he said, he'd do for me. And Chief Scout was with Steve, and he said, he didn't play very well, Ron. But Steve said he'd do for me. I said, well, he'd do for you after that performance. You should have seen him last week. And we signed Mark Bright. That's what happened. I used to watch Crewe a lot. John Pemberton came the same way. I missed the midfield player at Crewe, who, of course, David Platt. I rued that one. I don't know how I missed Platt. I watched Jeff Thomas so much and so much in love with Jeff Thomas that I missed the emergence of David Platt, and I could have signed David Platt, because when we bought Jeff, Dario said to me, Platty would be the next one to go, Ron. And we didn't take Platty.
It was around about this time, of course, you say that finances were pretty tight, but you set up Lifeline, and that was something that I don't think any other club had done at that stage, had they?
Well, they had done it. Bolton had done it, and they were great friends of mine, the people at Bolton. So we followed them. We had a launch at the Fairfield Hall. At one time, we had actually 5,000 members. But that was, of course, when we got to the cup final, and you had to be in Lifeline to get a priority cup final ticket. But we had 3,000 members consistently, which raised £300,000 for us. So the trick really with Palace was that it took me to 84 to get to a break-even point, and the gates were down to about 6,800. But we could break even. In 84, when Steve came, I was able to say to him, Steve, we haven't got a seller player to break even. And that was the stepping stone really to progress, because if you didn't have to sell someone to break even, you could actually build the team. That was the most important thing for Steve and I when he started. We actually didn't have to sell. We could go out, and that £50,000 that we had, that surplus money, was great because we could buy Jeff Thomas and didn't have to sell anyone. And we started building the team from there. And I built the facilities as well while I was at the club. And one of the things that I suppose I'm quite proud of the 17 years that I did there, because when you look around the ground, besides going to Wembley 5 times, which we did in my day, we also built the White Horse Lane stand, we built the Holmesdale Road stand, we seated the Arthur Waite enclosure, we built the 3-storey building, which is the Vice President's, the boardroom and the Players' Restaurant on the front of the main stand, and we also surfaced the car park immediately outside the main stand. All of those things we managed to achieve, and I believe it's only those things, and I always believe that the facilities at the stadium produced you the income that enabled you to spend money on increasing wages and retaining your best players. So that was a policy which I've followed all the way through. I mean, you look at Selhurst Park, I got to a situation where everyone in the main stand was effectively going through a bar to get to their seat, which is something I've done at Wimbledon, but we only had 600 seats at Wimbledon. So I remember how our catering income went up from 250,000 a year to 2.5 million. The Lifeline brought in 300,000. And even despite that, we were still losing about £1 million a year on trading all the time. But we sold players. And one summer, I sold players worth £14.5 million. It paid for the Holmesdale Road stand. But at the same time, we came third in the first division the following year, because the underneath the first team, the reserves, which Chris Conn was in the reserves at that time, they were so good, they were ready to come in. And we had a really good side as a first team side. But of course, the fans weren't ever going to like that. They weren't ever going to accept that. But we were continuing to build up Sellers Park, increasing our income, keeping our better players for longer. And my only regret really is that we came out when we did.
Well, I mean, going back to the period where John Solarco, for instance, was breaking into the team, and perhaps we got the first success promoted via the playoffs. You brought in Eddie McGoldrick from Northampton, and sort of Right and Bright were really starting to score lots of goals, weren't they? And Stan Turnant came on the scene at that stage too, didn't he?
Yeah, but I wasn't. I didn't really know Stan. I remember Steve and I going and watching McGoldrick at Northampton, and bringing him in. And because earlier you mentioned Ian Wright. Well, Ian Wright just walked in. We were so lucky with that. We had Mickey Stewart had recommended Andy Gray, who was playing for Dulwich. So we went and one wet night and saw Andy Gray, who then tried to score from the centre spot, straight from kick-off. We signed Andy Gray, I think, for £2,000, and Ian Wright just walked in and asked if he could train with us. And just amazing. And if I can just for a minute just some background to the Ian Wright story. I mean, I used to go down the training ground every day, and at that time, for some reason or other, I was so busy doing something that I hadn't been down there. And Steve came into my office and he said, Ryan, he said, I've got this amazing kid. He's just walked in. He said, he'll never be a pro, but you should see the tricks he does, football tricks, unbelievable. So I said, oh, all right. So anyway, a week later, because Steve was coming Friday afternoon at the end of the week, a week later, Friday afternoon again, he comes into the office. Oh, you should see this kid. He said, don't think he'll ever be a pro, but you should see the things he does. So the third week, he comes in, right, I think he's got a chance, he says to me. So he said, I want to pay him expenses. So I said, well, you can't, not unless he signs a contract. He said, what do you mean? I said, I'm not having you, if he's that good and he's doing the things you're talking about, I'm not having him on expenses. I said, because he'd just walk out. And so he said, what should I do then? I said, you can give him a contract for the value of his expenses. So I think he had to give him a contract, I forget what it was now, about 30 quid a week for his expenses. And anyway, at the end of 3 months, of course, we gave him a new contract, and then another one, and of course it went on from there. But once we had Ian, I think he was subbed 36 times before he played his first match. Once we had him, I wasn't going to see somebody who was going to be that good just walk out after we'd done all the work.
We eventually got into the first division, of course, but things looked a little bit grim, especially when we were beaten 9-0 up at Anfield in that first season. So it must have been a great delight for you when we finally met them in the FA Cup semi-final.
Well, look, the Anfield game, I mean, I got home late that night, I don't know, at 2 o'clock in the morning. My wife was in bed and she said, what happened? I said, you wouldn't believe it. I said, we actually really played well. We just kept attacking them. She said, but you lost 9-0. I said, it doesn't matter. I said, we really played well. We just didn't know when to shut up shop. And then of course, pure fluke. We're playing them in the semi-final, which was the greatest match, I suppose, in my football life. And at half-time, I think we were only 1-0 down. So, to me, that was it. We'd done the worst. We weren't going to get stuffed again by 9-0. And I remember Malcolm on television at half-time. He was the only one out of all the pundits that gave us a chance.
Indeed.
And before we got to our seats, Pemberton had gone down, steaming down the right wing, and we'd equalised. And of course, we had Richard Shaw put out their leading goal scorer. He was injured, he went off injured, and what a fantastic match. Just unbelievable game. I still think it's the greatest game that I've ever seen.
As far as the Palace fans go, that really was perhaps one of the greatest highlights, really, wasn't it? I mean, we produced some great football on that day, and really after that 9-0 thrashing, nobody gave us a chance, did they?
No, they didn't. And coming back down the motorway, that return trip back to Croydon, down the M1, it's just you never forget it. Just fantastic, the atmosphere. And then of course we moved on to the final. Naively, we were winning 3-2 with 7 minutes to go, and we kicked along and gave them possession instead of playing possession football. You know, and that semi-final was a tactical achievement for Steve Coppell, because for anyone who remembers the game, we actually passed the ball from the keeper to Andy Thorne and back again, and between them, and they drew Liverpool to us before we moved off, and that was something that Steve did. And he played Salako at left back on the team sheet, and of course that was something else as well. Something that he did. So I think that match was a brilliant tactical success for Steve Coppell, if people knew the background behind it. When we got to the final, Ian came back from his broken leg, ran a ring round Pallister and scored.
How proud were you sitting in the Royal Box when the team came out on the pitch?
Very, because I mean, there's a lot of pictures that I've got in the box, and most of the time all I'm doing is looking at the Palace supporters, because
only 14,000 of us, of course, which was a little disappointing, wasn't it, in the first game?
The same thing happened on the ZDS when Jeff Thomas was holding the cup up on the ZDS. I'm just looking at the red and the blue at the end was just tremendous, and the red and the balloons, of course, we were the first people really to start the red and blue balloons, which I think was Mike Ryan at that time, was commercial manager then. So it was just fantastic atmosphere, and the pictures, I've got pictures in my villa in Spain of the fans, pictures of the fans and all the coloured faces and everything on that game. But we were up 3-2. Nigel kicked long. They came back, and of course the Welshman scored the equaliser. And then I think, because our players came off the pitch thinking Manchester United were beaten, and they were beaten in the replay before the first match had finished virtually. And for some strange reason, there was obviously an influence in the dressing room, and we came out a lot more physical in the replay, and we lost 1-0, which was sad. I regret the way we played in the replay, and I regret the colours we played in. I thought they were awful.
Yellow and black.
Yeah, never. I just didn't believe yellow and black. I could stomach when I was told we were playing in yellow and black, because we had trouble getting a set of shirts at such short notice. But the yellow and black that we played in, and then the way that we played, we were capable of beating them at that time. And when you look back at the videos of the game, I mean, we had a team of young athletes. It's amazing when you look at the players. They were young athletes, all of them. And I laid down the rules on signing players for our coaching staff, and for Steve and for Ian. And there were 4 principles that we followed. One is they had to be 6 foot tall. 2, they had to have pace. 3, they had to be capable of playing at higher level. And 4, they had to be 23 or under, because we had to keep them 5 years and sell them at their peak to help develop the club. And they were the principles. And you weren't ever going to get all 4 with a player. But if you got 3 out of 4, okay, that's fine. If you got 2 out of 4, you should really consider whether you're doing the right thing signing. And that was one of the things as a yardstick that and when you look at Jeff Thomas, his age, his height, his pace, his ability to play at a high level, he had all 4, Jeff did. Andy Gray pretty well, was maybe 5'11", not 6 feet, but everything else that he had. And Mark Bright had all 4. And pace, the thing about players was pace. Pace was the ingredient that nobody could cope with.
That following season, you mentioned there the ZDS Cup, winning that, but we had the most successful time in our club's history, really, finishing in 3rd. Yeah. You must be very disappointed that perhaps we didn't go on in subsequent seasons to keep that sort of level of performance up.
Well, we were cheated, weren't we? We should have been in Europe.
Indeed.
And because of Liverpool and the chairman of the FA at that time, we were excluded. And not only that, even when we then moved, when the English clubs were allowed back into Europe, we weren't compensated by being invited. If we'd have been a more fashionable club, as a qualifying club for Europe who was denied access, they probably would. If it had been Liverpool, they'd have invited them in first, wouldn't they? But no, we were cheated.
This is something that obviously still irks with you.
Yeah, it does. Because, for Palace were 3rd in the First Division table. Can you believe that? It doesn't matter about all the promise of the past. They never achieved anything like that before. And the other thing that annoyed me was that we only got 15,000 people, average gate, for that First Division campaign, with the likes of Brighton right up front. And the fans never realised the quality of the players that we had at Sellers Park. And of course, Ian moves on to Arsenal and he's feted as a god, and sort of 40,000 people turn up every week to watch him. But they didn't do that at Selhurst. We never actually got the following that I thought we deserved for what we'd actually achieved in the team that we were putting out. Nigel Martin, first £1 million goalkeeper. Bruce Dyer was first £1 million teenager. We were spending money, but we were spending money within our own resources. Because we could afford to, because we balanced the books from the beginning. And I think the club made a lot of progress right through my period there. But of course, when it came to, which you'll probably talk about later, I suppose, Goldberg coming in, the fans thought that we were a yo-yo club. I believed you had to yo-yo in order to actually get there and stay there, which Charlton have since proved. But you had to go up and come down and go up and come down for your players to get experience, to keep your better players, and then at some stage you ought to be able to survive there. And I thought that's what we had to do. And of course, you give fans success, and their expectations are even higher. And they obviously felt at that time that I'd done as much as I could for Palace and I should move on.